Back in the 19th century, when Karl Marx was basically being chased out of continental Europe by all these nervous monarchs and censors, he actually found a safe haven in London.
Yeah, London of all places.
Right. I mean, he was just able to sit peacefully in the reading room of the British Museum writing Das Kapital, which is it's a text entirely dedicated to dismantling the very system his host country was built on.
Which is pretty wild when you think about the historical context.
Exactly. The British establishment definitely didn't agree with him, but they were secure enough in their own parliamentary democracy to just sort of tolerate his presence.
They had that psychological security.
But fast forward to today, and that same British government is actively drafting legislation to force tech companies to artificially suppress independent journalists and alternative media.
Right, it's a complete 180.
Like they're literally trying to rewrite the plumbing of the internet to ensure citizens only consume state-approved legacy news. You really have to wonder, what happened to that unshakable bastion of free speech?
The contrast is honestly startling. And it points to this profound shift in the psychological security of Western institutions.
So where does our source material fit into this?
Well, the source material we are unpacking today is this deeply analytical, wide-ranging broadcast from a Dutch independent media platform called the Nieuwe Wereld, which means the New World.
Okay.
And they argue that this shift isn't just an isolated British phenomenon. It's a symptom of a much larger systemic panic.
A panic from who exactly?
From the establishment elite across the West. They are experiencing what the broadcasters describe as a massive crisis of authority.
Meaning they feel like they're losing control.
Precisely. They feel they are losing control of the narrative, and out of internal fragility, they're abandoning centuries-old traditions of open debate in favor of top-down information control.
It creates this intense cognitive dissonance for the average person. I mean, you hear the official statements from politicians, you read the curated headlines, and then you look at the reality playing out in your own neighborhood or on the global stage.
And the two realities simply do not match.
Right? They don't match at all. So our goal with this deep dive today is to trace that exact phenomenon, what the source calls an institutional disconnect.
We are going to examine how this gap between the elite narrative and physical reality manifests everywhere, from the algorithms on our phones to bureaucratic rebellions in small Dutch farming towns, all the way up to Mark Rutte's Donald Trump in the battlefields of Ukraine and Iran.
Now, before we really jump in, we need to give a quick disclaimer to you, the listener. The source material contains highly charged political and geopolitical viewpoints from both sides of the spectrum.
Very charged.
Yeah. So the rule for this deep dive is simple. We are not taking sides. We are impartially unpacking the arguments, the critiques, and the worldview presented in this specific source material.
Just to help you understand the current cultural and political friction, we're looking at the architectural blueprint of their argument.
Exactly. We're dissecting the anatomy of their argument. And that anatomy really starts with the foundational layer of modern society, which is how information is distributed.
Right. And the source hones in on the United Kingdom's recent regulatory push, which they describe as a prominence regime.
A prominence regime. Let's unpack the actual mechanics of that, because it's not just a vague cultural shift. It is a highly technical legal manipulation of how data flows to the public.
Yeah, this prominence regime concept represents a fundamental reversal of the Internet's original promise.
How so?
Well, if you look back at the explosion of social media, these platforms became global juggernauts because they democratized curation. For the first time in history, the viewer was the editor.
Right. You chose what you wanted to see.
Exactly. The algorithms were totally agnostic to prestige. They serve content based on organic user engagement, completely bypassing the traditional editorial rooms of London or New York or The Hague.
So what is the UK government trying to do now?
What they are attempting to do, and what similar European frameworks are exploring, is to place legal pressure on tech companies to alter the weightings within their recommendation algorithms.
So they are essentially demanding that the tech companies artificially inflate the trust score of established legacy media like the BBC.
Yes, while simultaneously applying a negative coefficient to independent creators. They basically shadow ban them.
It's like rewiring the water pipes in a city so that the pressure only flows to the old, decaying Victorian mansions, while deliberately starving the newly built neighborhoods of water.
That is a perfect analogy. And the legal frameworks often disguise this under the banner of combating misinformation or, ensuring authoritative sources are visible during crises.
But the source doesn't buy that reasoning, do they?
Not at all. The source argues this is purely a defensive maneuver by an elite class terrified of losing its monopoly on reality.
Because alternative voices are getting too loud.
Right. When independent journalists or alternative media platforms begin routinely breaking stories that contradict the state's preferred narrative, the state's reaction isn't to improve its own arguments.
Which is what you'd hope for in a democracy.
Right. But instead, their reaction is to change the algorithmic rules of the game so the competitor simply disappears from your feed.
But doesn't the source acknowledge that some alternative voices do just spread misinformation? Like, why are they so defensive of these outsider voices?
They do acknowledge that bad info exists, sure, but they make a compelling argument that this exclusionary tactic is also deployed against physical human beings, specifically public intellectuals who don't fit into neat, easily controlled boxes.
Oh, right. They bring up that fascinating case study from the Netherlands, Maurice de Haan.
Yes, Maurice de Haan. He is a very well-known public intellectual pollster and statistician in the Netherlands.
And what happened with him?
Well, during the COVID-19 pandemic, he became highly critical of the epidemiological models the Dutch government was using to justify severe societal lockdowns.
But he wasn't just spouting conspiracy theories, right?
No, not at all. He was utilizing his background in statistics and data analysis to point out mathematical flaws and unproven assumptions within the state's modeling. So recently, he was called to appear before a parliamentary inquiry investigating the government's handling of the crisis.
And the reaction of the Parliamentary Commission is where the source finds the real smoking gun of institutional arrogance.
Exactly, because instead of engaging with his mathematical critiques, instead of actually looking at the data he brought to the table, the commission dismissed him purely on the grounds of his credentials.
They basically looked at him and said, you are a statistician, not a virologist.
Right. They said, you don't have the hyper-specific academic pedigree we demand, therefore your math is irrelevant.
Wow. They attacked the man standing to protect the institution's model.
Exactly. And the broadcast uses this specific interaction to mourn a profound cultural loss in European society, what they call the death of the doctorandus.
The doctorandus. Can you explain what that means for people who might not know?
Sure. Historically, a doctorandus was a Dutch academic title, roughly equivalent to a master's degree, but it carried a much broader philosophical weight.
Okay.
It signified a broadly educated intellectual. The underlying assumption was that if you possessed fundamental academic training, you had the cognitive tools to read complex data, evaluate methodologies, and participate meaningfully in debates across various disciplines.
So the doctorandus is the ultimate generalist. It's the belief that a highly literate citizen can look at the raw data of virology or climate science or economics and spot a logical fallacy without needing to spend 20 years sequestered in that specific subfield.
Right. But the source is arguing that the modern establishment views the generalist as a profound threat.
Why is that?
Because a generalist can see the connections between fields. A hyper-specialist, which is what the modern system demands, is often trapped in a single narrow narrative.
Give me an example of that.
We'll take a virologist. They might create a model to perfectly minimize viral transmission, but they might lack the economic or sociological training to understand that their model will simultaneously cause catastrophic supply chain failures or a mental health crisis.
Right. They only see the virus.
Exactly. The source argues that true, healthy public debate absolutely requires broadly educated intellectuals who can cross boundaries and challenge the narrow focus of the hyper-experts.
By insisting only the hyper-expert is allowed to speak, the establishment artificially narrows the debate to a domain they entirely control.
It's epistemic closure. If the only people allowed to debate the virology models are the people whose entire careers depend on the funding structures of institutional virology, you are never going to get a paradigm-shifting critique.
You're only going to get minor adjustments to the status quo.
Exactly. And furthermore, when you combine these two mechanisms, the algorithmic suppression of alternative media and the credential-based silencing of the generalist intellectual, you get a comprehensive system of top-down narrative control.
A sealed ecosystem where only their preferred experts are visible to the public.
Right.
But the friction occurs because you can only control the digital feed and the parliamentary inquiries for so long. Eventually, the pristine, curated models of the elite have to interact with the messy physical reality of the citizens' daily lives.
And when those two things collide, the system starts to fracture.
Which brings us to the physical administrative rebellion happening right now in the Dutch provinces. We are talking about the asylum crisis and a deeply controversial piece of legislation called the spreading sweat.
Yes, the spreading sweat. which translates to the asylum distribution law.
Hmm.
It is a perfect case study in how this institutional disconnect manifests in physical geography.
So what exactly is this law?
Well, the Netherlands is heavily impacted by global migration trends, and they're facing a severe shortage of housing and resources for asylum seekers. The central government in The Hague, spearheaded by politicians like Minister Eric Vanderberg, designed this law to forcefully mandate how many asylum seekers each municipality across the country must absorb.
So it's a quota system.
Exactly. The legislative logic is entirely quantitative. We have a national burden, we have a certain number of towns, we will mathematically distribute the burden across the map.
I mean, on a spreadsheet in a central ministry, that probably looks like perfect logistical fairness. But if you're the central government, aren't you just trying to fairly distribute a national burden? Like, why is the source framing this as tyranny rather than just logistics?
Because the source details how this top-down mandate is sparking a massive crisis of authority on the ground.
Yeah.
We aren't just talking about citizens holding protest signs in the town square.
No.
No, we're witnessing entire local governments, mayors, and city councils engaging in administrative civil disobedience.
Oh, wow. Entire local governments.
Yeah. The broadcast specifically highlights municipalities like Oldebroek, where local councils are looking at the central government's quotas and simply refusing to comply.
How do they even do that? I mean, a municipality can't legally rewrite national immigration law, right?
No, they can't. But they control the local zoning permits. They control the local safety and fire regulations. They control the allocation of local police resources.
I see.
So these towns are essentially using bureaucratic friction to paralyze the central government's plans. They drag their feet on building permits for asylum centers. They cite insurmountable infrastructure concerns. And they force the minister into exhausting legal battles over every single location.
To understand why these local administrators are willing to risk severe legal penalties to fight the central government, you have to look at the practical reality of what The Hague is actually demanding.
Right.
The source pulls out a very telling statistic regarding the physical infrastructure of these asylum centers. They point out that out of 107 reception facilities operating in the Netherlands, only 4 of them are small scale.
Only 4. The vast majority are massive industrial scale complexes.
And that scale is the crux of the local grievance, right?
Absolutely. The data suggests that when asylum seekers are placed in small-scale facilities fully integrated into the existing fabric of a community, the friction is minimal.
Right. People can actually get to know each other.
But the central bureaucracy favors large-scale centers, often housing hundreds or even thousands of people, because it is far cheaper and more efficient for The Hague to manage one giant contract with a catering company rather than 50 small ones.
So the bureaucracy optimizes for its own convenience, completely ignoring the sociological impact on the receiving town.
Exactly. When you drop a massive isolated facility into a small provincial town, you aren't integrating people. You are creating a parallel society on the edge of town.
And the source highlights that these large centers invariably generate severe negative externalities that the central government doesn't have to deal with. Things like spikes in local crime, rampant shoplifting, street harassment, and a general erosion of public safety.
Right. The Hague gets the moral victory of fulfilling its international asylum obligations while the local town pays the entire social and financial cost.
To contextualize why this is causing such a profound constitutional crisis, the source brings up the breakdown of the House of Thorbecke. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the House of Thorbecke is a vital piece of Dutch political architecture. Johann Rudolf Thorbecke was the statesman who fundamentally redesigned the Dutch Constitution in 1848.
Okay.
He created a decentralized system based on 3 pillars: the central government, the provinces, and the municipalities. And his philosophical genius was the belief that the municipality is the foundation of democracy.
Because it's closest to the people.
Exactly. Power should be delegated downward, ensuring that policies are shaped by the immediate physical realities of the local community. The central state was only supposed to handle matters the municipalities could not manage themselves.
But the spreading sweat entirely inverts the House of Thorbecke.
It does. The Hague is treating the municipalities not as foundational democratic pillars, but as mere franchise locations of the central bureaucracy. They are stripped of their autonomy in order to execute a national ideology, regardless of the local damage.
The facade of local control is completely shattered.
Right. And the broadcast frames this administrative rebellion in places like Oldebroek, not as isolated in ambiwayism,
Yes.
not in my backyard, but as the opening skirmishes of a decade-long ideological war.
A war between who?
They define the combatants very clearly. On one side, you have local reality-based networks of citizens and administrators who prioritize social cohesion and physical safety. On the other side, you have what the source explicitly terms progressive woke internationalism.
Woke internationalism.
Yeah. They argue the elite class in The Hague is deeply committed to a borderless globalist ideology, and they view local attachments as backward or bigoted. The state apparatus is being weaponized to force this worldview onto rural populations that violently reject it.
But this ideological sorting isn't just happening geographically with the Cosmopolitan Center forcing its will on the provinces. The source argues it's being deliberately engineered intellectually, too.
Yes, specifically in how academic institutions decide who gets resources and who is allowed to participate in the production of knowledge.
Which takes us to the university battlefield. The deep dive scrutinizes a highly publicized move to bring 31 foreign scholars to the Netherlands.
Right, they classify them as threatened scientists.
Oh, wait, though, isn't protecting threatened scientists a noble, centuries-old university tradition? Like, isn't the source being a bit cynical here?
It is a noble tradition, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the source takes profound issue with how this specific initiative is being executed. They point out that many of these imported academics are not fleeing physical violence in war zones.
Okay, so what are they fleeing?
They are being designated as ideological refugees. They are essentially scholars coming from universities in the United States or other Western countries where the political climate has shifted against their specific brand of research.
Research like what?
Often highly progressive gender studies or disciplines deeply critical of conservative movements like Trumpism. The Dutch universities are fast-tracking them into positions not to save their lives, but to rescue them from environments that are no longer politically hospitable.
And the source reacts to this with visceral frustration. To grasp why we have to understand the brutal economic mechanics of modern academia in the Netherlands right now.
Yes, it operates on extreme artificial scarcity.
Right. The traditional path of securing a tenured professorship has largely vanished for the younger generation. Local Dutch researchers survive on what are called flex contracts.
Which is just short-term, highly precarious employment. It's heavily dependent on winning hyper-competitive grants from central scientific organizations. There is simply not enough funding to sustain the domestic talent pool.
You have an entire generation of brilliant homegrown researchers essentially starving for resources. They're forced to abandon their research, take years off to work unrelated jobs, or leave academia entirely because the university claims the coffers are empty.
And then suddenly the university finds the resources, the housing, and the institutional willpower to import 31 foreign scholars purely because their political ideology aligns with the university administration.
The broadcast identifies this as the ultimate manifestation of elite symbolic politics.
That's exactly what it is. The university administration isn't making a scientifically optimal decision. They are making a political gesture designed to signal their virtue to the international academic community.
They are curating an ideological echo chamber on campus.
Right. And by doing so, they are actively abandoning the local, ordinary citizen researcher. It creates a devastating sociological filter.
Because if the institutional funding is redirected toward ideological allies from abroad, who is left among the domestic population that can actually afford to survive the grueling, underfunded gauntlet of a PhD and a postdoc?
Only the children of the wealthy.
Right, elite kids.
Precisely the point the source drives home. The academic system ceases to be an engine for meritocracy and social mobility. It transforms into a country club accessible only to elite kids who have the generational wealth to weather years of unpaid internships.
Combined with foreign scholars imported to maintain the required ideological purity.
Yes. The working class or middle class intellect, the person who might actually challenge the institutional consensus because their material reality is different, is systematically starved out of the conversation.
It is the exact same dynamic as the asylum centers. The institution prioritizes an internationalist ideological goal over the material well-being of the local population it is supposed to serve.
It's a recurring pattern.
And if you think this dynamic is destructive at the municipal or university level, the source argues it becomes exponentially more dangerous when it is elevated to the global stage.
Right. Geopolitics.
Yeah. We have to look at how this obsession with optics over reality plays out within the NATO alliance.
The broadcast spends considerable time analyzing the psychological and strategic dynamics of the recent NATO summit. And they focus intensely on the interaction between the outgoing Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte and Donald Trump.
The picture they paint of this diplomatic exchange is just entirely devoid of strategic depth. They describe it as a farcical exercise in mood management.
They use this brilliant family dynamic metaphor, which is just so spot on.
Oh yeah, the grumpy uncle.
Right. Donald Trump arrives at NATO, playing the role of the volatile, deeply aggrieved, grumpy uncle at a family gathering. He is hyper-focused on transactional metrics, furiously berating European nations for failing to meet their 2% defense spending commitments.
Insulting allies, threatening to shatter the foundational Article 5 Mutual Defense Pact if his demands aren't met. He's just an unpredictable wrecking ball swinging through the institutional porcelain shop.
And into this chaotic environment steps Mark Rutte, perfectly cast in the role of the cheerful nephew.
The cheerful nephew.
Yeah, according to the source's analysis, Rutte's primary function at the summit had absolutely nothing to do with negotiating grand military strategy.
He is entirely psychological.
Entirely. He was deployed by the European establishment to flatter Trump, to publicly validate his grievances, and to basically massage his ego. He stood in front of the cameras and explicitly credited Trump with forcing Europe to take defense spending seriously.
So the source is saying the highest level of global security has basically devolved into a reality TV show, where European leaders act as fluffers for an erratic American president just to keep the weapons flowing.
Exactly. Because all the oxygen in the room was consumed by managing Trump's mood, none of the existential questions facing the alliance were actually debated.
Right. There was no serious, grounded discussion about the shifting balance of global power or the structural reality of the war in Ukraine.
Or the actual endgame of NATO expansion. Instead, the summit functioned as what the source derisively calls an Oprah Winfrey show for defense contractors.
You get a drone, you get a fighter jet, everyone gets an artillery shell.
Right. It was just a massive, choreographed celebration of defense procurement. The European nations committed to pouring billions of dollars into the American military-industrial complex, buying advanced weaponry systems, without ever articulating a coherent strategy for how or when those weapons would be used.
And this is where the source introduces a deeply unsettling concept, borrowing a famous phrase from Winston Churchill, the bodyguard of lies.
Yes. Churchill believed that in times of existential war, truth is so precious, it must be protected by a bodyguard of lies.
But how does the source apply that here?
The broadcast argues that the Western political elite figures like Roos are currently acting as that bodyguard, but they are lying to their own citizens.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The mood management at NATO isn't just about appeasing Trump. It's a deliberate smokescreen to hide a terrifying reality from the European public.
They are quietly, systematically shifting the continent onto a war footing.
Exactly. They are signing massive multi-decade contracts for weapon systems, preparing the logistical infrastructure for a potential direct conflict with Russia by the late 2020s. But they absolutely refuse to have an honest, sobering conversation with the electorate about what that actually means.
They are managing the mood of the public the exact same way they manage the mood of Trump. Keep everyone distracted with the spectacle, keep the money flowing, and obscure the sheer cliff we are accelerating toward.
And the consequence of this strategic silence is that the West becomes trapped in a state of permanent escalation. When you cannot openly debate the reality of a conflict because it contradicts the curated narrative, you cannot formulate a diplomatic off-ramp.
Which means the true cost of this institutional blindness is currently being paid in blood.
Yes, particularly in the forever wars raging in Ukraine and the Middle East.
Let's transition to the physical battlefields, because this is where the theoretical critiques of the broadcast become grimly tangible. Starting with Ukraine, the source argues that the Western establishment has locked itself into a military fantasy that is mathematically and demographically impossible to achieve.
Right. The official narrative maintained by Western institutions is one of inevitable Ukrainian victory, contingent only on the continued flow of Western capital and weaponry.
The stated objective is the total expulsion of Russian forces from all Ukrainian territory, including the deeply fortified regions of the Donbass and Crimea.
But the broadcast forces a listener to look past the rhetoric and examine the horrifying mechanical reality on the ground.
They point to the proliferation of visceral, unedited videos emerging from Western Ukrainian cities like Lviv.
These aren't videos of heroic resistance, they are videos of pure desperation. We're seeing Ukrainian military recruitment officers violently abducting young men off the streets, dragging them into vans, while the civilian crowds violently clash with the recruiters in an attempt to save their neighbors from the draft.
It's horrific to watch, and the source forces us to ask, why is this happening?
The answer lies in demographics and the brutal tactical reality of the conflict. The war in the East has devolved into a grinding, static war of attrition, dominated by artillery drones and glide bombs.
The young men in Western Ukraine know that being forcibly conscripted and sent to the Eastern Front is increasingly a death sentence. The casualty rates are catastrophic.
The broadcast argues that the West's singular strategy, permanently funding a proxy war to bleed the Russian military, completely ignores the fact that Ukraine is running out of human beings to fight it.
We are pumping $70 billion of hardware into a country while simultaneously bleeding its future generations dry.
Exactly. The source suggests that the elite's insistence on total victory is serving the economic interests of the defense industry and the geopolitical aims of Washington, while systematically destroying the demographic survival of the very nation they claim to be saving.
It is a strategy disconnected from the biological limits of the Ukrainian population.
And we see a parallel failure of strategic comprehension when the broadcast shifts its focus to the Middle East, specifically concerning Iran.
Right. Let's talk about Iran, because for decades, the dominant institutional narrative in Western capitals was that the Iranian regime was fundamentally fragile.
Yes, the theory of maximum pressure. Severe economic sanctions and military isolation designed to squeeze the Iranian middle class so tightly that they would eventually rise up and overthrow the Ayatollahs.
The logic assumes that if you make life miserable enough for the citizens, they will blame their own government. But the source points out that this theory ignores the actual mechanics of how human societies react to external siege.
Right, when a nation is subjected to relentless external pressure, it rarely fractures. It almost always consolidates.
The broadcast highlights the massive funeral processions held in Iran for slain military and political leaders. We are talking about crowds that number in the tens of millions.
The imagery is potent. Seas of people marching beneath red flags, which in Shia Islamic tradition symbolizes a demand for revenge and justice, chanting death to Western leaders.
The source argues that Western intelligence entirely miscalculated the cultural depth of Iran.
They fail to account for a thousands of years old culture of martyrdom. The narrative of Ashura, the willingness to sacrifice oneself against an overwhelming oppressive force, is baked into the religious and cultural DNA of the region.
By constantly threatening Iran militarily and devastating its economy, the West hasn't broken the regime. It has validated the regime's core narrative. It has handed the hardliners the ultimate unifying tool. But wait a second. Doesn't the source acknowledge that the Iranian regime is incredibly oppressive? What about the women protesting the hijab and all the internal dissidents?
That's a crucial point. The source does explicitly acknowledge the brutality of the Iranian regime. They recognize the internal repression, the suppression of dissidents, and the extraordinary courage of the women protesting the mandatory hijab.
Okay, so they aren't ignoring that.
No, not at all. However, they argue that Western institutions blind themselves by only looking at those dissidents. They construct this comforting illusion that the entire country is waiting to be liberated by Western intervention.
They ignore the uncomfortable, terrifying reality that the regime also commands the fanatical, genuine support of tens of millions of people who are perfectly willing to endure economic devastation to defend their nation against what they perceive as Western imperialism.
Because the West refuses to see the strength of the adversary, they are constantly caught off guard when Iran expands its influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen.
This refusal to acknowledge reality has trapped the United States in a strategic nightmare.
It really has. The geopolitical reality is that the U.S. desperately needs to pivot its military and diplomatic focus toward the Indo-Pacific to manage the rise of China. But they are permanently tethered to the Middle East.
The source argues this tether is maintained by immensely powerful domestic forces, specifically the pro-Israel lobbying apparatus within American politics, which demands a policy of continuous confrontation with Tehran.
The U.S. cannot leave due to domestic political pressure, but staying and escalating against a unified, martyrologically driven regional hegemon is a recipe for a catastrophic, unwinnable regional war.
It's a recurring pattern, isn't it? In the UK, algorithms hide the truth. In the Netherlands, bureaucracy ignores local reality. In Ukraine and Iran, geopolitical strategy ignores demographics and history.
It's the same institutional blindness at every level.
Which leads us to the ultimate terrifying question. How are the institutions charged with understanding the world, the intelligence agencies with multi-billion-dollar budgets, the legacy media with global bureaus getting it so consistently catastrophically wrong?
The broadcast dedicates its final and perhaps most devastating critique to dissecting the structural failure of the Western sense-making apparatus.
They look directly at intelligence agencies, specifically referencing the Dutch AIVD, which is the General Intelligence and Security Service,
and the MIVD, the military intelligence equivalent. The source's core thesis is that the modern architecture of these agencies guarantees intellectual failure because they have systematically purged historical thinking in favor of quantitative management.
They argue that the agencies are currently staffed by bureaucrats, project managers, and data analysts who excel at processing signals, intelligence, intercepted phone calls, satellite imagery algorithms.
But they fundamentally lack historians. They lack the people who understand the deep generational cultural forces that actually drive human conflict.
So when a modern intelligence analyst trained purely in quantitative risk management looks at the invasion of Ukraine, their analysis begins in February 2022.
Exactly. They view it as a discrete, isolated data point. A border was crossed. An unprovoked aggression occurred. Therefore, the adversary is acting irrationally and must be countered with kinetic force.
The analysis operates entirely within the self-contained present-day Western narrative.
But a historian doesn't start the timeline in 2022.
Right. A historian starts in the 1990s, analyzing the verbal agreements regarding NATO expansion. A historian looks at the 2008 Bucharest summit, where Ukraine was promised NATO membership against the explicit red lines of Moscow.
A historian studies the 2008 Maidan Revolution, the complex ethno-linguistic divides of the Donbass, and the deep, albeit toxic, cultural intertwining of Russian and Ukrainian history.
Without that historical depth, the source argues Western intelligence cannot possibly understand the motivations, the risk tolerance, or the red lines of its adversaries.
They are no longer engaged in the business of discovering the truth. They are in the business of managing crises based on an incomplete ahistorical narrative dictated by the political elite.
They manage the symptoms because they refuse to diagnose the disease.
Spot on. And the mainstream media, rather than acting as a check on this intelligence failure, acts as an amplifier for it.
I found the broadcaster's description of how they consume legacy media deeply revealing. They talk about reading De Volkskrant, which is a major, highly respected Dutch daily newspaper.
But they don't read it to learn objective facts about the world.
No. They explicitly state they use the mainstream media as an observation post.
The concept of the observation post perfectly captures the economic and social mechanics of modern journalism. The source argues that legacy media has become an entirely self-referential, closed-loop ecosystem.
Because the economic model of modern journalism heavily relies on access.
Right. Journalists need access to politicians and intelligence officials to get the scoop. The politicians strategically leak curated information to the intelligence agencies. The agencies brief the journalists publish the story, and then the politicians cite the newspaper article to justify their original policy.
It is an Ouroboros of elite consensus. The journalists and the politicians go to the same universities, attend the same conferences, and operate within the exact same ideological framework.
This closed loop is virtually impenetrable to outside reality. When the strategy in Ukraine begins to fail mechanically, or when the Iranian population unexpectedly rallies around their government, those facts cannot penetrate the ecosystem.
Because they contradict the foundational assumptions of the loop itself.
Which brings the broadcast to an incredible chilling paradox. We operate under the assumption that the West, with its constitutional protections for free speech, its First Amendment, its vast array of independent publications, is the most informed society on Earth.
But the source argues that we are actually living inside a highly sophisticated, algorithmically enforced, elite-curated information bubble.
The citizens of the free world are constantly subjected to mood management, told that our strategies are succeeding and our adversaries are crumbling.
While, ironically, the citizens and leaders of autocratic nations often have a much clearer, unfiltered view of our internal mechanics.
Right. The broadcast notes that Russian leadership, operating from within an autocracy, has unfettered access to Western open-source information.
They read the think tank reports, they listen to the dissenting podcasts, they watch the unedited footage of the NATO summits. They can literally hear Western leaders openly debating the logistical preparations for a theoretical war in 2028.
The autocrat understands the reality of the West better than the Western citizen does, because the Western citizen is being managed by their own institutions.
The source concludes that this self-imposed echo chamber is the fatal flaw of the modern West. We are high on our own supply.
We continuously underestimate the resilience of our adversaries. We miscalculate the demographic and physical limits of our military strategies, and we sleepwalk into unwinnable forever wars because our institutions have built a firewall against reality.
When you step back and look at the vast architecture of this critique, it is genuinely staggering. We've traced this thread of institutional disconnect from the micro to the macro.
We've seen how the British government attempts to legally rewrite the algorithms to silence alternative voices. We've seen how the Dutch parliamentary system weaponizes credentials to marginalize the generalist intellectual.
We've explored the administrative rebellion in the Dutch provinces, where local mayors use bureaucratic friction to fight back against the top-down globalist mandates of the spreading sweat.
We've examined the artificial scarcity in academia, where universities import ideological allies while starving local talent, transforming institutions of learning into elite country clubs.
We've dissected the psychological theater of NATO, where European leaders act as emotional fluffers for Donald Trump to avoid debating the grim reality of a looming war economy.
And we've looked at the catastrophic consequences of this reality blindness on the ground, from the demographic destruction of Ukraine fueled by military fantasy to the unification of Iran driven by the historical ignorance of Western intelligence.
The unified worldview presented by the Nieuwe Wereld is of an establishment elite that has entirely lost its ability to govern by organic consensus.
Because their internationalist ideology clashes so violently with the physical, historical, and demographic realities of the world, they can no longer persuade the public.
Therefore, they must rely on coercion. Algorithmic censorship, top-down legislative mandates, symbolic political theater, and the perpetuation of endless managed conflict to maintain their grip on the levers of power.
Which brings this entire massive journey right back to you, the listener. The ultimate value of engaging with a deep dive of this magnitude, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, is that it demands you audit your own relationship with the information you consume.
Tomorrow morning, when you open a news app or watch a press briefing or scroll through a social media feed, you have to ask yourself the hard questions. Are you being presented with the messy, complex, historical reality of a situation?
Or are you being subjected to mood management?
Are the institutions treating you like a capable citizen, a doctorandus equipped to handle difficult truths? Or are they treating you like a child whose digital environment must be padded and curated for your own safety?
Recognizing the mechanisms of narrative control is the first vital step in reclaiming intellectual autonomy.
And just when you think this institutional manipulation is confined to the heavy realms of geopolitics and domestic policy, the broadcast leaves us with one final, incredibly surreal detail.
Oh, right. This part was wild.
Toward the very end of the material, almost in passing, the commentators discuss a rumor that Donald Trump, during his presidency, actually used his diplomatic influence to intervene in international football.
Specifically, they mention him pressuring FIFA executives to overturn red cards and manipulate disciplinary actions for certain players.
It is a bizarre anecdote, but conceptually it is the perfect capstone to their argument.
It really is. Think about the implications.
Sports are supposed to be the last true meritocracy. They are governed by objective rules, physical boundaries, and the absolute final authority of the referee on the pitch. We watch sports to escape the manipulated narratives of politics.
But if that rumor is true,
I want to leave you with this thought to mull over. If the most powerful geopolitical leaders on Earth feel entitled to reach down and secretly manipulate the outcome of a football match just to flex their influence or manage a mood, is there a single square inch of our society left that isn't being actively shaped by a top-down institutional narrative?
it really makes you wonder.
Something to keep in mind the next time you watch a game, read a headline, or hear an expert tell you that everything is completely under control.